Hello, this is Retonia. Welcome to Race Talks with Retonia. Today we're going to be talking about something that is very important to me. It's called redlining. Its effect on the past and the present. It's going to be an interesting talk. See you in a minute.
Oh, say, can you see? That's what they want us to believe in so blindly. But we got to take a stand and start talking about the truth and the facts. So, let's chat. Race Talks with Retonia. Race Talks with Retonia. Yeah, Race Talks with Retonia.
Hi, welcome back. So let's talk about redlining. So I don't know if you really understand what it is, but redlining is an official practice that began back in 1934 with the Natural Housing Laws or Act, which established the Federal Housing Administration, which we all know as the FHA. The narrative of this racial discriminating practice happened between landlords and bankers and independent realtors who served to exploit and isolate African Americans from the housing industry. This is assumed that the reason that we had a redlining was because of personal preference. And even though that is very true, there is a lot of personal preference involved in redlining. It was also sanctioned, promoted, and upheld by our government in places like federal and state and local policies that generated segregation on purpose that is actually still happening today. In a book called Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, he argues and brings the perspective that this has been happening for centuries, that these policies that were built on segregation is still pervasive and happening today. So from the first time that we had public housing in 1949, President Roosevelt Franklin, it was called the Housing Act. And he encouraged white people to move out of the cities and into the suburbs. Now we know that is unconstitutional. It's called racial zoning ordinances. This was practiced all over America. This act allowed governments and cities to be selective of who they would allow into their communities. This resulted in an act that is called racial discrimination that we deal with even today. This is a false belief that the reason that these neighborhoods in the metropolitan area were segregated was because people just didn't want to live by each other. But there are many proof that was not necessarily true. There were communities that lived together all the time in the early 1900s. This began to happen even more frequently after World War II. And when veterans began to come home and there hadn't been a lot of home building projects going on. So the government decided that they were going to help and they were going to fund, because during the war, most of the government funds was going to the war. And so they had to regenerate the funds, and they began to do that. And they began to make what we know now is suburban life. And so what would happen is that they would make a community and they would zone it so that people of color, because of maybe how much it cost to live there, could not be a part or participate in these new homes that were coming up all over the country. This act was an act of prejudice, even though they said it wasn't. It was just an act of people not having the right kinds of funds. But we know that that's actually not true. During the Great Depression, the middle class and the working class had lost a lot of their homes because they could not afford them, because taxes was really, really high. People don't really know that how high taxes were during this time. So they decided that they would they would start construction and provide monies to build homes for predominantly white families, and just by happened to leave black families out. This was a program that they instituted in New York. I don't know if you heard of Levittown, but Levittown was a predominantly, well, really all white neighborhood that did not allow people of color to purchase homes in that. They also would not allow white families to resell those homes to people of color. And this is when redlining began to really happen. President Franklin said that he justified this because he felt that if African Americans would move in to these particular neighborhoods, that the property value would decrease. Now, the FHA had done a study, and that study showed that that was actually not true in the 1950s, that families of color were willing to pay even more just because they didn't have a lot of places where they could establish a family life. And so they would be willing to pay more. And even though their studies prove that African Americans moving into a predominantly white neighborhood in the 1950s would increase the property value, they lied and said that it would not. And so that was what was being, the propaganda that was being put out there, and that's what people begin to believe. And so when you have that happening nationwide, you begin to create this false narrative and this system that says if black people are in the area, that the property value was going to go down. And you know what? That's what began to happen. The property values where black people begin to reside begin to go down. Landlords would not keep up the property. They would not fix the areas. They would not keep the land groomed well. And even though African Americans were paying 2 or 3 times the amount of money that other people were paying, their areas of living were not being cared for. This is definitely connected to racial disparities. Therefore, African Americans would be crowded into high-rise apartments with very little options of other places to live, while white families were urged and even prone to move into what we call suburban areas. In 1949, President Truman proposed the Honesty Act, and which came from civilian housing. And this was, like I said, after World War II, that would help veterans get a loan to be able to provide a home for their family. And hardly no black veterans were able to participate in that particular program. And one of the reasons was because they had worded it where that if you had a job that brought that you were a domestic person, or that you were a farmer, or that you were in a position where you served as your job, then you were not allowed. And most of the times, 75 to 90% of the people that held those jobs in the 40s and 50s were people of color. So they were automatically excluded from this. And this is very harmful. So in the 1950s, the government subsidized mass production for what we call the suburbs. And you had what we call white flight. White families began to move out of the inner cities, the metropolitan cities, and they began to move to the suburbs, and that's how we have our suburbs as we have today. I know when we think about suburbs, do you see a lot of brown and black people in those suburbs, or do you even imagine in your mind that that is where it is? I know I've talked to several people, and we say good neighborhoods, and I asked someone at a time, I said, when you say good neighborhood, what do you mean? Who do you visualize? Who do you see in that neighborhood? How many brown and black people do you see there? And it was no answer, and they were quiet. So that kind of tells you. So population began to grow in the suburbs, and every now and then there would be maybe a brown or black person who was able to purchase a home, but their loans were very high. Their interest was very high, and they didn't have many people of color in those particular areas. The beginning, black people, in the beginning, in the 1940s and 50s, black people could actually afford to live in the suburbs, but they were not, like I said, they were not allowed. They were not given. They were not given the loans. Their loans were not approved, even though they were able to afford it. So this was very, very interesting to me. I'm going to kind of tell a little personal story. My stepfather, who was in the Navy, and he did get a GI Bill. So he did get a GI loan, but we could only live in certain neighborhoods. The home that we lived in was a beautiful home, and it was diverse, but it wasn't the home that we would have necessarily wanted to have. But that was the one that we were able to be approved of because of the stipulations and the ordinances and the zoning laws that were in place to discriminate against people of color. So, what does redlining mean? So I don't have a map, but there were lines drawn, and so if you were drawn in the red area, it signified to a realtor or to a banker or to a landlord or whatever that this was an area that was predominantly highly populated with people of color, normally low income people, and so that was considered red. They had yellow also, and yellow meant that it was a heavy taxed home, that there were people of color there, but maybe not as many. And then there was blue, and blue was also was completely developed, but there were maybe one or two people that were maybe not of high income, but medium income. And then there was green, and green was fully built up, primarily dominantly white, and hardly no people of color. So these things still happen, even though it's illegal now. You can't talk about it, but there are still places and areas where people of color are discouraged from living. One of the things that I read and found out in reading the Color of Law book, even though African Americans have 60% of the income that white Americans have, African Americans only have 5% of a cumulative wealth. And that's because wealth in America is based on property, is based on your home. And because our people were shut out of the economy and building wealth through our property and owning our property, we are behind in that. And so that's a disparity that we really, really do need to rectify. Okay, so what can we do to combat this? Well, of course, you know me. The first thing is always to educate yourself, always to learn and always to see how, and maybe ask yourself, how do you uphold these policies and ordinances and that you don't even realize that you're doing. I know a lot of people make choices, they make them based on what they believe is best for their family. But do you make choices sometimes based on what is best for the community, for everyone that is a part of that community? When you walk outside your home, do you see people that are different than you? And when you do see them, do you feel safe? And if you don't, why? What is that narrative that is going on in your heart? That's something I think that we just all need to really think about and contemplate. The other thing is to understand the laws and the zoning practices in your community. Check and see if they are fair. And if they are not fair, then begin to do some things to challenge the status quo, to ask them to change those things, to ask them to be more inclusive, to be more aware. Just don't only think about your four and no more. So I hope this was informative. I know this was a little heavy. The next few episodes will be. But I really do want us to really understand and to see how we can really begin to move ourselves toward dismantling all of the racial practices that have gone on way too long in America. So thank you for joining. This is Retonia with Race Talks. Have a wonderful day.